It was a night where luxury seemed to have a specific gravity, dense and suffocating, capable of crushing anyone not accustomed to breathing the rarefied air of high society. The Grand Ballroom of the Grand Hotel, a historic building that had seen kings and queens pass through, was hosting the year's most exclusive event. Crystal chandeliers, enormous cascades of light suspended meters above the ground, reflected the sparkle of diamonds, sapphires and rubies adorning the necks and wrists of the women present. The air was saturated with expensive perfumes, a mixture of imported jasmine, antique leather, and that particular metallic scent that seems to emanate from money when accumulated in obscene quantities. In the midst of this ocean of custom-made tuxedos and high-fashion dresses, shadows moved. They were the waiters, silent figures dressed in black, instructed to be invisible, to anticipate the guests' wishes before they were even formulated, and above all, never to disturb the perfect choreography of wealth. Among these shadows was Elisa, a young woman with dark skin whose features were perpetually contracted in an expression of professional concentration and detachment. For the guests, she had no name, nor a history. She was simply a pair of hands handing out champagne flutes and collecting empty plates. Elisa moved with an economic grace, calculated not to take up space, slipping between groups of people discussing corporate mergers and Maldives vacations without ever brushing against them. However, destiny had decided to play a cruel card that evening. In the center of the hall, surrounded by a group of flatterers who laughed loudly at his every joke, stood Arthur. Young, incredibly handsome in a predatory way, and obscenely rich, Arthur was the heir to a real estate empire, known not for his entrepreneurial skills, but for his immeasurable arrogance and the contempt he harbored for anyone he considered inferior. His posture was that of someone who owns not only the floor he walks on, but also the people who tread upon it. He was gesturing widely with a glass of aged whiskey in his hand, recounting an anecdote in which he was, inevitably, the hero who humiliated someone else. It was at that moment that the unexpected occurred, an infinitesimal fracture in the evening's perfection. A corpulent guest, laughing loudly at Arthur's joke, took a sudden step backward, bumping into Elisa, who was passing right behind him with a heavy tray loaded with crystal glasses. The impact was violent, but Elisa's instinct was rapid. With a superhuman effort, she managed not to drop the tray, saving hundreds of euros worth of crystal. But the abrupt movement caused a single glass to sway. A small, insignificant amount of amber liquid flew off, drawing an arc in the air before landing with millimeter precision on Arthur's mirror-polished Italian leather shoe. Time seemed to stop. The orchestra's music, a sweet background that until then had lulled. Conversations seemed to vanish into thin air, swallowed by the sudden silence that fell within a 5-meter radius of the incident. Arthur stopped speaking. He lowered his gaze slowly, with a studied theatricality, towards his shoe. A single drop was sliding down the black leather. It wasn't real damage. A handkerchief would have fixed everything in 2 seconds. But for Arthur, it wasn't about the shoe. It was about the principle. It was about the fact that a shadow had dared to touch his reality. Elisa, pale despite her skin tone, mumbled apologies, preparing to clean. But Arthur raised a hand, stopping her with an imperious gesture. His face showed not anger, but something worse, cruel amusement. His eyes, cold as ice, scanned Elisa from head to toe, dwelling on her anonymous uniform, her comfortable work shoes, the tray she still gripped like a useless shield. Arthur cleared his throat, ensuring that the people around him, and soon the entire hall, were listening. In a high tone of voice designed for the saloon's acoustics, he began his performance. He commented on her clumsiness, comparing her movements to those of a heavy animal in a china shop. He said it was an insult to the place's aesthetic. The crowd, sensing the smell of blood like sharks, moved closer. Suppressed giggles began to circulate. No one intervened. No one defended the girl. In that world, the spectacle of power-crushing weakness was the preferred entertainment. But Arthur was not satisfied with the insult. He wanted total humiliation. He wanted to demonstrate his superiority in a way that would remain etched in everyone's memory. With a smile that didn't reach his eyes, he launched his proposal, a challenge that sounded like a condemnation. He declared before everyone that if that clumsy creature managed to dance an entire waltz with him without stepping on his feet even once, he would marry her right then and there. It was a joke, obviously, a grotesque mockery based on the assumption that a waitress could have neither the grace nor the education to dance a Viennese waltz, much less with a demanding partner like him. The hall erupted in a collective, unpleasant, metallic laugh. Arthur's friends patted him on the back, praising his spirit. Everyone watched Elisa, expecting to see her collapse in tears, beg for mercy, or run away in shame, disappearing into the kitchens she had come from. That was the script written for her. The victim who accepts her role and flees. But Elisa did not move. She stood still, the tray still in her hand, and then something happened that no one had anticipated. The expression on her face changed, the mask of servility, the one she had worn all evening, all those months of work, cracked and fell away. In its place appeared not fear, but an icy, almost frightening calm. Her eyes, previously lowered and evasive, lifted and fixed directly on Arthur's. There was a depth in that gaze that made the billionaire's smile waver for an instant, a dark abyss, suggesting that he had just made a colossal miscalculation. Slowly, with a deliberation that silenced the nearest giggles, Elisa turned toward an empty table. She placed the tray down. The clinking of the glasses settling echoed sharply in the tense silence. Then she brought her hands to her hair. With precise gestures, she undid the strict, tight bun that was part of the uniform. Her dark hair fell onto her shoulders, framing her face and softening the harsh features. Imposed by work, she took off the black apron, folding it with maniacal care and placing it next to the tray. Underneath, she wore only a simple white shirt and black trousers, but suddenly it no longer looked like a uniform. It looked like a stage costume. The physical transformation was subtle but devastating. Her posture changed radically. Her shoulders lowered and opened, her neck lengthened unnaturally, her chin lifted with regal pride. She was no longer the girl trying to occupy as little space as possible. Now she seemed to expand, filling the void around her with a magnetic presence. Arthur, confused by that unexpected reaction, moved to say something, perhaps to double down or to chase her away, but the words died in his throat. Elisa turned toward him. She did not say a word. Words were not necessary. She simply walked towards the center of the floor, where he awaited her. Every step she took was measured, fluid, devoid of any hesitation. Arriving in front of him, she looked him in the eyes once more, with an intensity that almost forced him to take a step back. Then, with exasperating slowness, she raised her right arm and held out her hand to him, waiting. The entire hall held its breath. The orchestra, uncertain of what to do, awaited a signal. The conductor, sensing the electrical tension in the air, raised his baton, ready to give the attack. Elisa did not tremble. Her hand was as steady as stone, suspended in the air between her and the billionaire who had just mocked her. That outstretched hand was not a request for peace. It was the acceptance of a duel. Arthur, trapped in his own public wager, had no choice. With a poorly concealed burst of pique, he grasped her hand, expecting a weak, sweaty grip. Instead, he found surprising strength, fingers that positioned themselves with authority, ready to lead or to resist. At that precise moment, as the first violin was about to touch the string, Arthur had the distinct, unpleasant feeling of having walked into a trap that he himself had built. The conductor's signal cut through the charged air like an invisible blade. The first notes of Strauss's "On the Beautiful Blue Danube" began to spread throughout the hall, a classic Viennese waltz whose apparent lightness concealed a ruthless technical requirement for anyone who was not an expert. Arthur, with an still uncertain smile plastered on his lips, took the first step, a standard movement learned in the expensive etiquette schools he had attended since childhood. He expected to have to drag a dead weight, to feel the waitress's body stiffen with fear or stumble in an attempt to follow a rhythm unknown to her. He had already mentally prepared the final joke for when she would step on his shoe tip. But that moment never came. The exact instant the music took shape, the impossible happened. Elisa's body did not merely move, it transformed. What a moment earlier was a static waiting figure suddenly became an extension of the melody itself. Her back arched slightly backward with a flexibility that defied common anatomy, creating a perfect line that started from her neck and descended to the tips of her toes. Her left arm, resting on Arthur's shoulder, did not weigh at all. It was light as a feather, yet it conveyed a steel firmness that compelled him, almost unconsciously, to correct his own posture. Arthur was not leading, or rather, he believed he was, but the reality unfolding before the incredulous eyes of the guests was quite different. Elisa anticipated every beat with millimeter precision. Where Arthur used impetus and brute force to maintain control, she responded with fluidity and pure technique. Her feet did not touch the floor, they caressed it. The soles of her inexpensive shoes glided over the polished parquet with a grace that made the designer footwear of all the other ladies in the room seem clumsy. As the waltz accelerated, entering its most iconic swirl, the power dynamic Arthur had tried to impose completely crumbled. He began to feel the fatigue. The driving rhythm required breath and concentration, and Arthur, accustomed to the world obeying him, found himself having to chase a partner who seemed made of wind and fire. Drops of cold sweat began to bead on his forehead. His grip on her hand became tighter, almost desperate in an attempt to reassert his dominance, but Elisa did not give an inch. Her hand remained steady, an anchor point amidst the storm of turns that she herself was orchestrating with her movements. What made the scene even more unnerving for the billionaire was the eye contact. Elisa did not look at her feet to check the steps. She did not look at the audience for approval. She kept her dark, deep, indecipherable eyes fixed on his. She did not blink. In that gaze, there was no trace of submission, nor of vulgar triumph. There was only absolute competence, a technical superiority so evident that it was overwhelming. Arthur felt naked, exposed, analyzed and judged deficient by the very person he had called clumsy just minutes earlier. Around them, the hall had undergone a metamorphosis. The murmur of mockery had faded, replaced by an almost religious silence, broken only by the music and the rustle of clothes. The guests, who had formed a circle to witness the waitress's humiliation, found themselves mesmerized. Champagne glasses remained suspended in mid-air, forgotten. The giggles turned into mouths open in astonishment. Someone in the back rows pulled out their phone, not to film a ridiculous fall, but to capture a performance that bordered on the miraculous. A smartphone camera caught the detail of Elisa's tense and defined neck muscles and the elegance with which her free hand drew arabesques in the air, gestures that belonged on grand stages, not in a hotel ballroom. Arthur, now breathless, tried to slow down, to break that rhythm that was suffocating him, but Elisa did not allow it. With an imperceptible but inexorable pressure on his shoulder, she forced him to maintain the speed, dragging him into a sequence of fast turns that made the onlookers dizzy. For the first time in his life, The billionaire was a passenger, a necessary accessory only as physical support for someone else's art. His arrogance melted away under the heat of the spotlights, giving way to panicked confusion. He realized with growing horror that she knew the choreography better than he did, that she was covering his mistakes, compensating for his missteps with instantaneous adjustments that made the whole seem fluid. She was dancing for him and against him, all at the same time. The orchestra's final crescendo arrived like a sound wave. The cymbals clashed, the violins screeched in the last high, triumphant note. Elisa executed a final pirouette of dazzling speed, stopping exactly on the last beat, immobile as a marble statue. Her breathing was barely altered, her chest rising and falling with a controlled rhythm, while Arthur, facing her, was visibly panting, his face flushed and his hair disheveled. Elisa's final pose was the decisive thrust. She did not merely stop. She performed a perfect, deep, and theatrical reverence, bending her knees with a grace that echoed centuries of classical tradition. She lowered her head, not as a sign of humility, but as someone concluding a performance in front of a paying audience. She remained in that position for an eternal second, letting the image of her perfection be imprinted on the retina of everyone present. Then she straightened up. The magic of the dance vanished instantly, giving way to the raw reality of the moment. Elisa released her grip from Arthur's hand. She did not do it with anger, nor with violence. She simply opened her fingers and let his hand drop as if it were a useless object, something that had served its purpose and now held no value. She turned, giving him her back, completely ignoring the man who had promised her a marriage in exchange for that dance. The silence that followed was deafening, heavier than the one that had preceded the music. Arthur remained there, in the center of the hall, his arms still half raised, unable to process what had happened. But before anyone could applaud or speak, before reality could resume its normal course, the sound of a violently moved chair scraped the floor on the opposite side of the hall, drawing everyone's attention to the shadow of an elderly man who was rising. Tremblingly, his eyes wide, fixed on the back of the girl walking away. The sound of the chair dragged on the floor was not just a noise, but a violent interruption of the collective paralysis that had enveloped the hall. The elderly man who had stood up was no ordinary guest. He was a well-known patron of the arts, a severe and respected critic who had spent his life in opera houses across half of Europe. His face, usually set in a mask of aristocratic boredom, was now contorted by incredulous recognition. His trembling voice broke the silence, not to call security or to ask for more champagne, but to utter a name that had nothing to do with serving tables: Isadora Vance. That name echoed through the gilded walls like a sentence. For most of those present, young heirs and digital entrepreneurs, that name meant nothing immediately. But for those who knew the world of culture, for those who frequented the most exclusive artistic circles, that name was an interrupted legend, a ghost. The omniscient narrator of the evening revealed at that moment, through the whispers that began to spread like wildfire among the older tables, the truth hidden behind the black uniform. The woman who had just humiliated Arthur on the dance floor was not a simple waitress. 5 years earlier, Isadora Vance had been the rising star of international ballet, a technical prodigy who had broken racial and social barriers by becoming the youngest prima ballerina of a prestigious Royal Academy. Her career had been dazzling, destined for the history books, until the day she vanished without a trace. No farewell, no press conference, just a sudden void on the world stages. The truth, as raw and mundane as reality often is, concerned a silent family tragedy, a mother's illness, the financial collapse to pay for experimental treatments, the forced choice to disappear into anonymity to survive and pay debts, accepting jobs that made her hands rough and her identity invisible. Arthur, still, Gasping in the center of the floor, felt the weight of this revelation crash down on him, not like a physical blow, but like a cold shower of awareness. The whispers of those present became a clamor in his ears. Someone, quick to consult search engines on their smartphones, showed those nearby the archive photos. Isadora Vance in Swan Lake. Isadora Vance honored by heads of state. The comparison between those images of ethereal glory and the woman in the white work shirt walking towards the exit was devastating. Arthur realized with growing horror that he had not challenged a clumsy amateur, but had attempted to give a dance lesson to an absolute master. His arrogance had not just been rude, it had been ridiculous. Driven by a mixture of unbearable shame and a wounded ego desperately seeking a foothold to keep from sinking, Arthur moved. He couldn't let her leave like that, not with that defeat burning him and the marriage promise hanging over his head like a meteor sword of Damocles. He ran toward her, intercepting her just a few steps from the large glass doors that led out of that gilded world. He reached her and, in an instinctive, clumsy gesture, tried to grab her arm to stop her. It was the last mistake of the evening. Isadora stopped abruptly, but she did not turn violently. She simply lowered her gaze to his hand, gripping the fabric of her shirt. Her immobility was so eloquent that Arthur withdrew his hand as if he had been burned. There was no need for shouted words. The dynamic between them had irreversibly reversed. He, the billionaire, was now the desperate supplicant. She, the waitress, held all the power. Arthur, stammering, tried to recall the wager, mumbling disconnected phrases about being a man of his word, that the proposal was valid, perhaps trying to turn that defeat into a gesture of magnanimity, as if marrying her was still a prize he was granting her. But the reality was that he was trying to buy her silence and her dignity, with the only currency he knew, himself and his fortune. Isadora's answer was neither verbose nor emotional. She turned slowly toward him, looking at him with a detached pity that hurt more than any insult. Without raising her voice, in a calm tone that was clear to those close enough to eavesdrop, she destroyed Arthur's last illusion. She pointed out to him, with the coldness of an instructor correcting an untalented student, that a life together would be impossible, not because of the class difference, but because of a matter of rhythm. She explained to him that during that waltz he had shown he didn't know how to lead, was hesitant in the decisive steps, and used force where finesse was needed. A man who couldn't listen to the music and who pretended to drag his partner instead of accompanying her could never be by her side, neither in dance nor in life. With measured gestures, Isadora definitively slipped off the black apron she still held folded over her arm, the last symbol of her servitude in that place. She did not throw it to the ground in anger. She handed it to Arthur, placing it gently on his expensive arm, as if she were returning an object that belonged to his reality, not hers. Without waiting for a reply, which Arthur would have been unable to formulate anyway, Isadora Vance turned towards the doors. She pushed them open with both hands and stepped out into the cool night, leaving behind the suffocating heat, the expensive perfumes, and the man who had thought he could buy her with a challenge. As the doors swung shut, the hall remained immersed in a deathly silence, broken only by the distant sound of a notification on a cell phone. The video of the dance had just been uploaded online, ready to unleash a storm that no one in that room could yet imagine. The following dawn did not bring the silence Arthur had hoped for, but a digital clamor that shook the foundations of his privileged existence. The video of that improvised dance, uploaded by an anonymous viewer, did not just circulate, it exploded with the violence of a global phenomenon. In a few hours, millions of views accumulated, turning the billionaire's private humiliation into a public debate. But the narrative that took hold was neither that of the poor waitress saved by the prince, nor that of the modern Cinderella. The comments, editorials, and news reports focused on one single undeniable fact: the return of the exiled queen. The world was not watching a lucky girl. It was witnessing the artistic resurrection of Isadora Vance, the woman who had transformed an act of bullying into a masterful lesson in dignity. Arthur, barricaded in his penthouse, watched helplessly as his public image was torn to shreds. His public relations consultants advised him to remain silent, to wait for the storm to pass. But Arthur's ego, wounded and confused, did not allow him to remain inert. It was not just shame that moved him, but a nascent, dark, and persistent obsession. He watched that video on a loop, not out of masochism, but because in those dark eyes that stared at him during the waltz, he had seen something that no amount of money had ever been able to buy him. An absolute, unfiltered truth. He was convinced that the story could not end with her walking out that door. There had to be a final act, a closure that he could control. 3 days later, his private investigation bore fruit. Isadora had not returned to an ivory tower, nor had she been hired by a rival company. Arthur got into his armored car, leaving behind the shimmering financial districts to delve into the industrial periphery of the city, a labyrinth of concrete and graffiti where his Italian shoes looked like alien objects. The destination was an old community center, a building marked by time with peeling plaster, nestled between abandoned factories. When Arthur entered, the atmosphere that greeted him was the diametrical opposite of the hotel's gilded coldness. The air smelled of chalk, sweat, and old wood. In a large room with cracked mirrors and wooden bars, polished by use, Isadora was working. She did not wear gala attire, but a simple, worn training outfit. In front of her, 20 neighborhood girls, with second-hand ballet shoes and rapt looks, tried to imitate her movements. Arthur remained in the shadows, watching. He saw Isadora correct a posture, not with the coldness she had shown at the party, but with a firm gentleness, touching a shoulder, lifting a chin, instilling confidence. There, in that poor place, she shone with a light of her own, much more intense than the one reflected by the crystal chandeliers. Taking advantage of a break, Arthur stepped forward. A sudden, heavy silence fell over the room. The girls drew back, sensing the presence of a foreign and threatening element. Isadora turned, wiping her neck with a towel. She did not seem surprised to see him. Her gaze remained imperturbable, as if he were an insignificant detail in the vast fresco of her day. Arthur wasted no time. He placed an open velvet box on the scratched wooden table, revealing an embarrassingly large diamond ring, and next to it, a contract. With the voice of someone accustomed to solving every problem by writing a check, he presented his offer. He did not speak of love, but of keeping his word and reparation. He offered her not only the marriage promised for the wager, but the artistic direction of a new ballet company that he would found specifically for her, a theater under her name, unlimited resources. It was the move of the gambler who, having lost the game, tries to buy the bank. He sincerely believed he was offering her salvation from that misery. Isadora's reaction was the final plot twist of that dramatic affair. She did not even look at the diamond. Her eyes passed from the contract to Arthur's face with a kind of amused compassion. With slow gestures, she closed the velvet box and pushed it back across the table. To him, through the narration of those present, it became known that her response was final and sharp as a razor. She refused everything. She explained that the dance that evening had not been a demonstration for him, nor a request for help. It had been a reminder to herself, a way to remember that despite the uniform and the difficulties, her art had remained intact, an inalienable property that he could neither understand nor purchase. Arthur tried to reply, to insist that she was wasting her talent in that peripheral hole, But Isadora stopped him by pointing to her students. She made it clear that her success was no longer measured by the applause of an audience that paid expensive tickets, but by the possibility of transmitting that passion to those who had nothing. The refusal was total. Arthur found himself with his useless ring in his hand, surrounded by crumbling walls that seemed to possess more dignity than his entire fortune. The epilogue of the story arrived in the following months, not through the gossip columns, but through the cultural pages. Isadora Vance did not need Arthur's money. The media wave generated by the video led to a spontaneous and massive crowdfunding campaign from admirers all over the world. The old community center was renovated, becoming an academy of excellence for disadvantaged talents, with Isadora at the helm, free and independent. Arthur, on the other hand, remained a prisoner of his own ivory tower. It is said that on sleepless nights, he continued to watch that video on his gigantic screen, fixing on the only moment in his life when he had been close to something authentic. The final lesson was not about the dance, but about power. He had discovered the hard way that there are things that cannot be owned, and that sometimes the poorest man in the room is the one who only has money. And while the image of Isadora making the final reverence repeated endlessly in the silence of his villa, Arthur understood that that dance had not been the beginning of a love story, but the final act of his solitude.